Plenary 3 on disruptive technologies and economic regulations. I would request everybody to please be seated so that we can start on time. Okay. For this plenary, we have Ms. Isabel Durant, Deputy Secretary General UNCTAD in the chair. Other discussants are Mr. Barack Obich, Professor, University of Arizona, James C. Rogers College of Law, Mr. James Mancini, Analyst, Competition Division, OECD, Cassie Lee, Senior Fellow, ICS Yusuf Ishaq Institute. Can I also request Dr. Ajay Shah, Professor, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, to come on the dais, and Ms. Seema Gaur, Senior Economic Advisor, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Government of India. Madam Gaur, can you please come on stage? In addition to these discussants, we are having two paper presenters. Dr. V. Sridhar, Professor, International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, and Mr. Derek Ireland, Policy Consultant, Carleton University. Just to, as a precursor to this session, we had a very interesting opening session yesterday, wherein thoughts were also shared about regulating emerging issues and emerging technology, including how would data be regulated, and how would disruptive technologies such as multi-sided platforms be regulated. Do institutional capacities exist to regulate such platforms, and what should be the way ahead for ensuring optimal regulation of disruptive technologies? With this background, I would request Dr. Durant to take it over. We have a strict time frame for this session. This session will run for a 90-minute period, and my colleague would help you to manage the session. We have a red flag system, as all of us are aware now. Thank you so much, and request you to take it forward.
Thank you for this helpful support. So first of all, before to start, I wanted to make some opening remarks on this issue, because I think that the issue of this session, it's not the easier topic, but probably it's one of the more significant for the future of economy, because of the disruptive character of all those new technologies. First remarks. Second remarks, I think that it's a leitmotif since yesterday. There is or there is not a big difference between LDC and developed countries. Well, I think that it's both, because of course it was said yesterday and in other panels that of course it's not the same situation in LDC countries, because infrastructure, because low level of ICT literacy, etc. But there is a paradox, because there is also a capacity for people in LDC countries with those technology to have access to some activities absolutely not foreseeable before the generalization of this economy of platform. And you have also in developed countries many problems, what we call Uberization. Uberization, it means all the problems with taxation, with the new economy of platform. That's a problem for in Europe, in USA, and in developed countries. How do we manage that? How do we regulate it? And how we organize taxation for people working in a very new sector, or traditional sector, but with a very different way to work. So that's a second question. A third question is the question of algorithm. And that's, of course, an important question. Could regulation address the algorithm collusion? What about, for example, the price fixing? When a price is fixed by only algorithm, that's changed a little bit the way to work. What about the market and the market online? Is it or not a problem for some countries when the price is fixed and monitored on this way, as it was the case sometimes in the lobby of an hotel between two men discussing the price? It's very different today. It's permanent changing, and with this algorithm approach. And the last question, I think that some of the speakers will speak about the way to regulate or try to regulate the sector, and they will speak about more cooperative and polycentric approach in the regulation. Of course, we could agree on that, everybody in this room. But of course, technology, application, etc., it's asked and it requests skills, competencies, and capacity to discuss that. And I say it very frankly. So I said yesterday, I was minister in my country. It's very difficult for a minister or for the civil society or for the citizens, well, not so well trained in technology, to be part of this cooperative or polycentric approach. So it means that it could stay in the hand of only technological people, and that's also a kind of, it could be a problem if you base your regulation only on this cooperative approach without people able to be part of the discussion because of the lack of competence or specific skills. So that was 4 questions in order to start, and directly I give now the floor to the first speaker. He received 10 minutes, if it's good. Yes, 10 minutes for each, and so I give the floor to Mr. Sridhar.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks to CUTS for inviting me to this particular workshop. So the topic of my discussion is regulatory aspects of two-sided markets. As the chair has pointed out, digitization has leveled the playing field. For example, so the digitization is really created a level playing field between countries. For example, today we have about 6 to 7 unicorns. That is, $1 billion or more valuation from India, and Bangalore is listed as number 15 in the tech ecosystems in the world. So, in that context, I would like to note down specific aspects with respect to two-sided markets, because most of the startups that you see in the world today, including Airbnb or Amazon or Uber, they are all belonging to this particular category of two-sided market platforms. So, the important characteristics of these two-sided market platforms have regulatory connotations. For example, these two-sided market platforms bring two sets of users together. The users are listed here, as you can see. For example, the cab seekers and cab drivers in the case of Uber, and sellers and buyers in the case of Amazon, and so on and so on. Now, the important aspect of these two-sided platforms is the network effect. The network effect is not only within the user set, but also across the user set, which is classically referred to as the cross-site network effect, propounded by Lafont and Tirole way back in 2004, and a classic paper was written by Eisenman in Harvard Business Review. So this cross-site network effect has very important connotations, because these sets of users depend on each other, and as one set of user base increases, the value for the other set of users increase, and therefore it has a cyclical effect. And therefore, the value that the users derive from using these two-sided platforms almost grow exponentially. So, this has a lot of important connotations. Before that, I just want to brief a taxonomy of the two-sided markets. The two-sided markets can be very slim at the top, such as, for example, directory services, such as Truecaller or Just Dial in the case of India. It can be aggregated platforms which enable the two sets of users to come on board, such as, for example, Ola, Uber, or Airbnb. Or it can be e-marketplaces, which might sell the products, but they will also be involved in non-digital activities, such as delivery and so on. For example, Amazon or Flipkart belong to this particular category. And we, really think that it has economic value, because the most important aspect of these two-sided market platforms, any of these categories, is bringing down information asymmetry. There's a huge information asymmetry between the set of users, and using digital platforms, they reduce that, and thereby providing economic value, increased consumer surplus, and possibly also increased producer surplus, who are on board of the two-sided market platforms. However, what has not been addressed significantly is the question of liability, disintermediation, regulatory arbitrage, and search cost. For example, if you look at these platforms, the liability of the e-marketplace is very high compared to, for example, a directory service which provides just information. In the case of disintermediation, directory services provide much more disintermediation effect compared to, for example, e-marketplaces. Regulatory arbitrage for e-marketplaces is very high because they have different business models. They have, they operate, can potentially operate across state or even geographical boundaries, and therefore there can be a huge, regulatory arbitrage that these e-marketplaces face compared to, for example, directory services. Directory services provide a huge amount of, reduce the search cost, bring down information asymmetry quite a bit compared to, for example, e-marketplaces. So these are some of the characteristics of these two-sided marketplaces, which will have regulatory connotations. The important aspect is, typically the two-sided marketplaces are not monopolies or near monopolies. However, competition is minimal, and that has been propounded by Eisenman, has been found to true in most of the cases, and therefore regulation has a place to play. Multi-homing is typical. The users need not just home onto one platform, but they can home onto multiple platforms at the same time. How do we deal with this? Typically, platform differentiation is minimal because it's a commoditized service. Anybody can imitate. The imitation effect is very high, and therefore, in general, the platforms tend to be non-differentiated, and therefore, it is necessary for any of the platforms to attain the critical mass for sustainability. Asymmetric pricing is very common. The pricing that is charged by the two-sided marketplaces can be asymmetric. One side need not pay. It's normally called a subsidy side. The other side normally pays. For example, in the case of Uber, the drivers pay, and the people who take drives do not pay as the platform charge. The last one is platforms reduce information asymmetry, and therefore they collect a lot of user information and personalize the services. And therein lies the concerns of data privacy, data protection, and so on. So, what are the regulatory questions? The regulatory questions are, we know that because of the huge network effect which is required in order for these platforms to sustain themselves, and the increasing economies of scale due to network effects, normally these platforms tend to do predatory pricing, right? And at least in the initial stages, in order to attain the critical mass, we call this as capital dumping, right? So as we see, BC money is being dumped in order to give discounts, and why are discounts given? That is to increase the critical mass so that they can be on the exponential growth phase. Now, is this what is the effect? The effect is reducing competition. Capital dumping is being used as predatory pricing to wipe out competition. So one of the regulatory responses could be to do time limiting of discounting. See, these are still evolving. We don't have a regulatory mechanism in place in order to, for example, regulate these two-sided marketplace in any way. The second aspect is horizontal vertical integration. So as these tools, the marketplaces become bigger, they can acquire even the users from either sides, and therefore they can actually become monopolies. And therefore, there has to be a regulatory response in mergers and acquisitions. This is more so in the case of digital platforms which provide digital services. For example, a telco acquiring a media company, right, to provide its services is a classic example of vertical integration in the digital marketplace. The third one is homing. What if a platform offers exclusive contact to sellers and outbid the competition? Because we know that the two sides of users are required, but it is possible that the platform might have exclusive contracts in order to prevent multi-homing of one set of users, in which case it might reduce competition, and therefore there has to be a regulatory response. What is the user lock-in? What is the switching cost? Do we have to prevent such kind of behavior in the case of platforms? Then the use of information collected for unintended use, because information asymmetry is the biggest problem, and that these platforms are trying to solve. They collect a lot of data, and therefore they can use it for personalized services, but it can also be used for non-intended services. So in the absence of true data protection act in our country, there has to be a regulatory response, whether it can be a mandatory user consent or user rights on the collected information. These are all some things which we need to really worry about. Then there is first mover advantage. Yeah, because these platforms tend to be first movers, they do platform envelopment, and they might take a lead over the competitors. So we have to have regulatory response with respect to significant market power assessment. And the last thing is, are these just technology platforms? Do they disown any kind of responsibility and liability for the physical goods and services that are being provided over these platforms? This has to be again taken up by the regulator. So there are a lot of regulatory guidance which we can propose. For example, there can be mandatory compliance on the case of platform providers. For example, cabs should be run on LPG. That's a classic example in the case of Ola and Uber that the Delhi High Court has given. Or food safety check to protect the health of foodies. For example, in the case of food aggregators. So there can be mandatory compliance. The other market regulatory rules such as fair regulation or FDI regulation or any of those things can be left without any regulatory intervention for these platforms to prosper. The other totally different view is that should we have regulation or should we have self-regulatory organization with a government oversight in order to look at the two-sided marketplaces. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much. So I invite Mr. Derek Ireland from the Carleton University to present also his paper.
And Pradeep for inviting me here. This is the third time I've had the opportunity to travel 2/3 of the way around the world to present a paper for CUTS, and it's always a delight. Now, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about a very big issue. I have 10 minutes, and I'm not going to go over, because this is new territory for me. I'm one of the least techie economists you'll ever meet, and therefore when I started discovering that we were moving into algorithmic consumers and robot sellers and algorithmic regulators, my first inclination was to say, horror story sounds like Stanley Kubrick back in about 40 years ago, where computers are going to be driving us crazy. Let's make sure I'm hitting the right one here, up and down. This is. Okay. Anyway, main argument is that as we move forward in this area, it'll be a good idea, I think, we bring a behavioral lens to this. I've been doing a lot of work on behavioral economics in a regulatory competition consumer protection setting over the last 20 years. Secondly, that we're looking at not tame problems where we can get together and solve the problem in a couple of hours, but wicked problems that will constantly mutate, constantly be changing, where information and evidence on regulatory harm may not be as straightforward, and so on. The main argument I would be making, based on work I've been doing on wicked problems like climate change and financial market reform, is we need a much more open regulatory process. Because when we move into wicked problems, expertise can only take you so far. The economics, legal expertise, technical expertise. The wisdom of the crowd becomes all that much more important. And more importantly, it becomes more important because the crowd, the public, are going to have to understand what these technologies are all about, why they generate benefits, why they may generate harm, and what might be done by them themselves as well as others to help to rectify the problem. The first thing that struck me when I started getting into this literature, which was only about a year ago, because in fact most of the literature I was reading has been produced in the last 3 years, is there's a lot of actors in the digital marketplace, and they're expanding daily. We have algorithmic consumers, which allow me to outsource my decision making on financial services and a lot of other things that I don't like wasting my time on. Now, I used to do that with my wife, but now I can do it to a computer program. I think that might be great for my wife, as a matter of fact. Secondly, we now have algorithmic suppliers and robo-sellers. So you've got algorithmic consumers transacting with algorithmic suppliers, i.e. the producers and the retailers and so on that are out there. The government is now starting to get into the game, and some of the more recent documents suggest that could be a very, very good thing. But algorithmic regulators that can be either government run or maybe outsourced to the private sector, or maybe even operating privately by the private sector for profit, can be another source of another set of sources that will be influencing not only the competitive game in markets in the future, but also the regulatory game. Other literature is talking about algorithmic educators, that our kids are learning about algorithms, coding, and so on from a very early stage. And I remember when I had a 3-year-old granddaughter 17 years ago who knew how to operate the computer better than I could at that point in time. So I suspect they're very ready for that. There's another literature on how cooperatives can go digital. They're called platform cooperatives. And this could be a new source of competition in a variety of markets. I come from a country and some places in the country where cooperatives have been very, very important and very, very effective in the farm sector, for example. Then, of course, you've got the conventional companies using algorithms for a variety of reasons. One of them being that they are using algorithms to help them to comply with all the regulations that they need to comply with. And my skeptical nature, having worked in a competition bureau for a while, is they might be using those algorithms to figure out how to avoid regulation, how to avoid competition, how not to be detected. But then perhaps I'm being too nasty. And then you've just got an expanding number of final consumers who are very happy to, as the previous two-sided platform presentation mentioned to us, they were very happy to escape the regulated markets, because they will go to platform markets, two-sided markets, and so on, where there may be free goods, where the prices are lower, and where they're not being put up with some of the service suppliers who they're not happy with. Many of the problems are sort of like the comment that somebody made earlier about old wine, new bottles, and so on. Some of the problems look similar to what we had before, but take on a new set of issues when we're looking at the digital marketplace. Obviously, we're concerned about market concentration, expanding market power. And in this case, of course, you're looking at expanding market power from the point of view of product markets, information, technologies, and increasingly a concern about how these kinds of algorithms can be influencing who we elect and who is in government and who is not in government in one way or another. There are major information asymmetries involved in these kinds of platforms, and that provides new opportunities for product differentiation, for improving products, but it also provides opportunities for collusion and a variety of forms of anti-competitive and anti-consumer conduct. There are important information barriers. I think this is a point that probably needs to be discussed here more, that because of a variety of reasons, a number of the players in the digital marketplace do not have to provide full information. It may be because of patents, it may be because of trade secrecy, and it also sometimes can be because they're operating in areas where certain government security concerns could be arising. Therefore, their information is being protected and is not being shared with regulators, with the public, and so on. The privacy concerns, of course, are major and have been talked about a great deal. There's also a literature on the undisclosed biases of operators and so on creeping into these algorithms and how they might be used. They can be poorly designed. Evidently, the Facebook folks were surprised that perhaps their computer software was being used to influence an election. I think we can extend too much faith and confidence in these algorithms. There's, I think, conflicting government roles and responsibilities and functions. On the one hand, they have to regulate. On the other hand, every government wants to be a world leader in market learning applications. So there's an awful lot of reasons for concern. In short, we're talking about a wicked set of problems, which in my view require new approaches to innovation and new approaches to regulation. And that's all kind of in front of you, and I think we've already gone through an awful lot of this material already. Possible issues for discussions. I've included in my paper a lot of discussion on what wicked characteristics mean in the context of the digital marketplace, finding the right balance, and what the implications are for developing economies. And one of those is certainly In my view, along the lines we've been talking about in a number of sessions, the developing economies may wish to be a little slower in responding in a regulatory, a competition, an IP fashion with this until it gets worked out. I see nothing wrong with free riding on the efforts that the European Union and the Americans are making, and Canadians have been free riding on those efforts for a long time, and I would suggest that might be a good idea, because as pointed out by a number of people, sometimes the worst thing a regulator can do is establish an unnecessary regulation that proves to be a disbenefit to innovation in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those two presentations. You give us more question as answer, but maybe it would not be the case with the discutant, and they will have a proposal regarding regulation and how we will work on that. So first of all, I will give the floor to Mr. Barack Orbach from the University of Arizona James A. Rogers College of Law. Okay, so Mr. Orbach, you have the solution and the answer to all the questions, I think.
Thanks, and thank you. I really think I'm grateful for the organizers. It's my first time in India, so I'm really happy to be here, and I greatly enjoyed the conference. I'd like to make a few comments about Professor Schitter's paper and to tie to the general topic of disruptive technologies. So I'd like to make 5 general observations. First, what's the meaning of a disruptive technology? Second, the general context of disruptive technologies. Third, the potential need for regulation. Fourth, performance measurements. And fifth, general comments about the applications in India. So the comments will be brief by the nature of considering the time limitations. So disruptive technologies, this is a term that people use a lot, and it actually doesn't have a universal meaning or doesn't have any technical definition. So it is important to understand that when two individuals use the term, it actually they don't necessarily mean the same thing, and probably they don't have any meaning in mind. They just say something because they heard it before. So it is kind of a broad term, but generally we're talking about a technological change or significant technological change, and any change is disruptive. You know, when I go to a hotel and the bed looks great and I get into the bed, I'm disrupting the order in the bed. And the thing is, why do we have the term? It's because change creates some discomfort, and that's why we basically have this conference, or that's why there are so many conferences about presently the resurrection of the term disruptive technology, because we have a lot of disruptive technologies around. We have significant technological change, and people are uncomfortable with that. So, but again, it's important to understand, we just talk about considerable technological change. There's nothing unique in the term disruptive technology. So that's number one. So number two, the general context of technological change. We're basically in the midst of an industrial revolution. Now that's, people don't, for economists it's really important to define the industrial revolution, and it's really a lot of measurement of technical meaning, but it would be silly to think that we are not in the midst of industrial revolution. For all purposes, we are in industrial revolution, and that's the general context of why we have so many disruptive technologies. And what Chida was talking was one of the major contexts of the disruptive technologies, platforms. I think that we do not actually have any general specification of platforms, so I think that actually it's very, very tricky to specify or have any taxonomy of platforms. They're just still changing and forming, and that's a problem. That's one thing in context of platforms. It's also important to recognize that we have other forms of changes in the economy. We're moving, for example, one of the key things, we're moving from fossil energy to more efficient forms of energy. Another thing, we have advanced materials, and another thing is in health we make a considerable progress, which is not necessarily good because people will live longer and we'll have more people and they'll consume a lot of things. But one of the aspects that, especially in the context of platforms, is that we have new forms of business, of firms, companies, which is a new thing. In the first industrial revolution, firms emerged. Second industrial revolution, we had the new firms of or what is called the firms of the 20th century, which separated control and ownership. And now we have the new firms that are basically platforms. So platform, there's one type, when people say platform, they mean one thing, they mean organization of market. The other thing is they mean structure of companies, which is basically a new structure which we don't have an exact specification. One of the things is gig companies. It's a very different thing. It's a very unique thing. So that's the context. The third point that I wanted to the third point that I wanted to make was the performance measurements. And we generally people use the term consumer welfare in a misleading concept, or social welfare. In antitrust, we do not have a term, the antitrust methodology doesn't allow measurement of welfare. What it allows to do is to measure a surplus. When we have changes in the economy, we have many things that are non-transparent. So, for example, changes in some aspects of the price are not monetary. People, for example, right now, people don't pay. There are many free products and people pay with their information. So when there are such things, then there are many laws that are called consumer rights or stuff like that. So this is one thing that is important to understand, and that's the nature of the regulation. So in the terms of regulation, one of the things that we see one aspect which would be the traditional economic regulation, which would be about surplus and other things. Another type of regulation that we'll see, it's about the new nature of the firm, and the other thing will have a lot of social regulation because of the general changes in the economy. And the last point I wanted to make, is related to India, which actually I know very little about India, but I could still make two observations. The specification of the platforms that you made in your paper is, I could even tell that it's relatively partial, because many gig companies, global gig companies, use Indian gig workers, and they would continue doing so more efficiently. So I think that actually much of the inputs of India for the gig economy is connection to the global companies rather than internal operation, and that will probably continue to grow. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that India is probably is considered to be the future, is already the battleground of Alibaba and Amazon, which it's the only one, because so far around the world, Alibaba and Amazon separated and did not compete. To the extent, and if Alibaba and Amazon would compete in India, they would crush any possible company, and that's quite significant. So these were my comments.
Okay, thank you for this contribution and also this Indian point of view. I give now the floor to Mr. Cassie Lay, Senior Fellow on ISCAS, USOC Ishak Institute. Sorry.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm tasked to discuss Professor Sridhar's paper, and I will do that, and I'll then go beyond discussing some of the issues that might be relevant. This issue of disruptive technology and regulation is a very serious one. I come from Southeast Asia, and we have heard about examples of ride sharing, for example. If you look at the regulatory response in the 10 ASEAN countries, for example, to the emergence of ride sharing in Southeast Asia, the response has been varied, right? If you look at Singapore, basically free entry with gradual re-regulation of this particular market. If you look at Indonesia, initially they said, yes, come in. And then they started imposing price cap, is the latest one, which doesn't exist in other markets in response to price surge. You look at Thailand, yeah, you can do it as long as you don't get caught. Right? So governments are really struggling with this one. So this is a timely kind of topic. So Professor Sridhar looks at what are the issues relating to technological disruptions, in particular focusing on the two-sided or multi-sided platform markets, and what are the regulatory challenges. I find his discussion is quite interesting because what he does is he maps out what are the different types of disruption and what are the policy guidance that you might have. There are some challenges in terms of the policy response that are suggested. For example, predatory pricing. It's extremely difficult to determine to what extent predatory pricing is occurring. Take, for example, the Singaporean market. Indeed, there has been a lot of discounts and price war happening between Uber and Grab in the Singaporean market. And yet, it's kind of difficult because to say it's predatory pricing, because the strategies that companies are adopting is shifting week to week. And the strategies involve not only the pricing, but incentive systems they give to the drivers. And the disadvantaged taxi sectors are also evolving. So part of this challenge in crafting a regulatory response to technological disruption is you cannot predict what are the firm level responses that will come up. Last week, for example, I was shocked to discover there is a new service in Singapore where the taxi company has decided enough is enough, we'll up our game. We introduce a new service. You can use an app to book a taxi anytime for any duration and take it to the road and use it to kid customers. So imagine if you want to drive a taxi, provided you have all the license, you can log in the app. Okay, I'm free. I don't have any lectures from 5 to 7 today. I'll drive for 2 hours. Then you can actually book a taxi and be a taxi driver for 2 hours. Never, when the Grab share came to the market, Grab and Uber, never would imagine taxi changing their mode of operation. So this is part of the regulatory challenges in dealing with issues like predatory pricing. In terms of horizontal and vertical integration, merger control, this is another interesting. Part of the challenge, for example, with platform, is not so much as the ownership issue, it's information, right? I ran some computer sim, that's part of my hobby. I ran some computer simulators on how platform compete. And one of the scenario is that, well, they don't merge, but they share information on how many cars do they mutually have and what's the demand in the particular area. And with that, they can actually price like a monopolist, essentially, right? So looking at regulation, looking at technological disruption like Uber and Grab, you need to rethink what are the regulatory variables that are relevant here. And in this particular case, information is very interesting. Regulators in the new economy, digital, have tremendous amount of difficulty in collecting information. They have no idea what's happening. So one of the regulatory challenge could be, without being too invasive, how do you collect information? For example, in the case of Uber and Grab, I have suggested to regulators to do two things. For example, one is in Singapore, each driver of Uber share, they have to register and put a sticker up front that said they are a ride-sharing car, right? One of the ways to monitor is now to issue, I suggested maybe they'll do it, issue a new kind of sticker which emits signal, so as you travel through different places, a regulator can collect the demand and supply fluctuation within different areas. And then if they do a sampling of information, they can get a better sense of the market developments in this area. So I've seen the red flag. I have quite a number of points here. So I'll go to discussing some of the key points. One of the issues with technological disruption is the dynamic nature. And this changes, technology is always going to be changing. And by creative destruction or creative disruption, regulators need to think about how to regulate when you are not certain of the outcome. One approach is to have a more evolutionary, adaptive way of doing regulation, in which you see the problem as a sequence of steps and then decide at each step where is the red line. Cartel is no, but what is permissible, and then allow the market to evolve and see how consumers are affected and how firms are changing at the same time. So it's a kind of like, it's not necessarily saying that, so lagging behind technological change, regulatory lagging, is not necessarily bad because it's inevitable, right? More importantly is because regulators, nor firms, nor regulators have the predictive power of what will happen. It could be an optimal way of looking at it. Regulators also need, like as I say, to change how they think about. For example, I just give one example. In the traditional taxi market, we are always sort of fixed in terms of thinking about prices as fixed prices, calculated based on a normal rate of return, that's what you get. But when you look at the ride-sharing market, what we need to think about distributions of prices and how they evolve over time, not only across time, but spatially, right? In terms of prices in CBD, housing area. And the algorithms that are used can affect behavior on both the sellers and the buyers. For example, Uber, for example, Uber drivers do not know where the passengers are heading. That's the algorithm that's used. They know which passenger to pick up from where, but they have no idea. But for Grab, the drivers know where they're picking and where the destination is. That changes the incentive system of the driver, the supply system, so much so that drivers for Grab can choose, I don't want to go there, it's too congested. But Uber drivers, they don't, right? So that changes. So those are the things that's my point about technological, the uncertainty and adaptive regulation.
Thank you so much for this interesting contribution. I do give now the floor to Mrs. Semagor. She's Senior Economist Advisor at the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology in the government of India. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I wish I had the answers to all these complex questions raised in the two presentations, but honestly, I have none. All I have are some observations on Professor Sridhar's presentation, along with some observations of my own. Well, there is no doubt that sharing economy and associated two-sided platforms, actually, they have tremendous potential in promoting public welfare. And Professor Sridhar's paper has brought out, he has raised some pertinent issues regarding regulatory challenges posed by this platform. These platforms are disrupting not just the markets. In fact, they are also challenging existing regulations and raising many legal issues all over the world. And key issue is how do governments and regulators keep up with the rapid disruptive innovation of these platforms. As India has many two-sided platforms in diverse products markets, this issue is as pertinent for India as at the global level. So what exactly is the challenge? I am going to, actually my predecessors have discussed this issue more at a micro level. I am going to take more of a macro view. So what exactly is the challenge? See, digital platforms call themselves technology intermediaries, and they are only connecting producers and consumers, and hence they consider that they are not subject to regulations of the concerned markets. On the other hand, affected incumbents of disrupted markets are accusing actually these disruptors of flouting market regulations and even of anti-competitive behavior. So this is the key issue. The stand on two sides are very different. Uber is perhaps the best example of regulatory challenges posed by these platforms. Uber had in fact such a profound impact on taxi market all over the world. That backlash now includes worldwide protest, fights, and eventually government intervention. Regulators all over the world, in fact, are debating whether to, allow to continue this, service, efficient service which citizens like, or shut it down because they are not following regulations, or maybe they are challenging the existing order, and so many other issues. I agree with the paper that due to lagging regulation, these platforms are enjoying tremendous regulatory arbitrage. For example, in terms of tax burden and insurance coverage, etc., platforms like Uber and Airbnb, they do not play by the same rules as applicable to, analog or traditional market players. And in a struggle for survival and market share, actually, these traditional players are demanding better regulation of these disruptors and level playing field. In fact, very soon, European Court of Justice will decide on whether Uber is a transport company or digital platform. In case the court decides that it is a transport company, then Uber in Europe will be subject to all the regulations applicable to this sector, and that will raise their cost of operating in Europe. So this brings out the challenge of, challenges posed by these platforms. Second issue raised in the paper relates to either low or nil liability of the digital platforms. For example, Uber and Airbnb try to wash up their hands regarding liability for actions of their drivers and landlords respectively. However, this appears to be very unfair and against societal interests. The paper rightly advocates mandatory compliance of regulations relating to public interest, safety, consumer protection, social harmony, etc. For example, rooms offered on Airbnb and OYO should adhere to the fire safety standards just like all other hotels are expected to do. Well, coming to the next issue, this paper has recommended that the digital platforms require different rules compared to the traditional brick and mortar businesses. In my view, this is largely not correct. One view is that the existing regulatory frameworks are not well suited to dealing with the existing models of the disrupting innovators. Alternative view is that after all, disruptive innovation is not a new phenomenon. Markets have always been shaped by successive waves of disruption for so many years. Well, I think entirely different rules are not really required to deal with digital disruption, but the existing ones, they may be supplemented by some new rules wherever needed and updated and all as per the demands of the situation. For example, one particular area that comes to mind is, now these platforms are collecting tremendous amount of data, personal data. So there are serious issues relating to privacy and security of this data, and definitely regulation on this issue is needed, no doubt. Another issue relates to intervention by competition authorities. All over the world, these platforms are actually facing action by competition authorities, although some people view that the very fast, rapid, disruptive nature of innovation in these platforms actually will not allow, this market power to be maintained for a long period. But fact is, all over the world, competition authorities are intervening in these sectors to keep the markets open, competitive, and free for innovation. Why? Because the presumption is that peculiar characteristics of these platforms actually increase the likelihood of that market power being maintained and its abuse over time. Now, critical question is, what is the right way to force in competition law in these markets, given that traditional economic analysis is not really, by and large, not applicable to this digital platform. There are serious issues regarding market definition of market power, etc., and so many other complexities. And one more thing, the competition in these platforms is actually dynamic. Normally in competition analysis, we take the static view of competition. So how do competition authorities really, check the anti-competitive behavior in these markets? while they are trying to, maintain the incentive to innovate. I believe that there is no need for really, a different kind of competition policy. The existing policy, along with, let's say, refined and innovative kinds of tools and techniques, plus taking the dynamic view of the competition, I think this type of competition policy can really provide answers to all these questions that I have posed. So these are just some of the challenges that have been mentioned in Professor Sridhar's paper, and I have commented on them. I feel these challenges actually, they suggest some kind of, let's say, some kind of imperatives. Just 2-3 observations. One is that to confront challenges posed by the disruptive technologies, regulation should be fair, cautious, balanced, and timely, without impeding innovation. Now, that last line is actually very, very important. Further, there can't be a blanket solution, so regulatory solution should be tailored to specific circumstances. But now, just 1 minute. This is easier said than done, To do this actually, as I think it was brought out by one of the earlier speakers, regulators, they have to be they have to build up their capacity, they have to continuously update understanding of these new disruptive technologies, their effect on markets, consumer competition, but this itself is actually a very, very challenging task. Given the nature of these markets, it is not really easy to do that. Second point is, now as more and more companies are operating across multiple markets, regulators across different markets actually need to collaborate and find out what are the best practices, what works and not. And in many cases, this may actually also require collaborating across the border. For example, to regulate anti-competitive measures in these platforms. And lastly, we all know that the regulation and competition policy actually exists to help unlock economic value for consumers and society. And regulators should be wary of simply protecting incumbency at the expense of realizing this value. Let me end by thanking Professor Sridhar for taking up a highly relevant topic, raising the right questions, and suggesting some good ideas for further thought and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. So, two discutants have now to deliver their speech or their comment, and I give the floor to Mr. Ajasa from the Yusuf Ishka Institute. Sorry. National Institute of Public Finance and Policy.
Thanks. This is a very interesting session. I just want to say that I am personally astonished at how all of us have shifted from being respectful, bordering on reverential, towards the amazing things being done by technology companies, to a mood of being far more skeptical about how these things work. It's fascinating how much this thing has come. I look forward to a place where all of us will treat participation in social media as being like smoking, but we're not quite there. So it's coming. I'm sure it's coming. Okay, I think that the old knowledge of public economics is a useful way to think about these questions. In classical public economics, we are taught that there are 4 kinds of market failures. There is market power, there is asymmetric information, there are externalities, and there are public goods. And these are the 4 things where the free market fumbles and makes mistakes. And somewhere in there, you might find a useful role for the government and for state intervention. So in that sense, there's nothing new going on here. We just have to reinterpret these old timeless ideas in the new context. So in that sense, the crimes are old, the means through which crimes are committed is new. And in that sense, we can fall back on a lot of old knowledge and old jurisprudence and old understanding. So it is not all new. It is actually one more round of a story that's been going on for hundreds of years. When electricity came, people started getting electrocuted and governments set up safety standards for plug points. Okay, so it's the oldest story in the development of state. Where I think this is more problematic and is more difficult is in the problem of state capacity. We are being faced with a unique level of complexity, and it is going to require considerable capability on the part of governments to do well in intervening. Okay? Governments also have failed many times all through history. Governments have fumbled and been inept and have interfered with human progress. So we've got to be very mindful of that. And what I think this situation calls for is a new level of capability, of expertise on the part of the state. That the fumbling, blunt, crude, politicized, corrupt practices of government, which is a fair description of many parts of the world, is going to be a problem. So I think that's the story. The real story is not that high technology has created a new set of problems. The real story is that there is a confrontation between low state capabilities and the questions that we face. What do I see happening here in India that is different from the global discourse? I think that there are three things that are interesting and different about India when compared to some other places. The first thing that is different about India is that we are more like Europe and less like the United States and less like China, in the sense that we have no technology giants who are effective in the Indian political system. Okay, so in the United States, firms like Facebook are extremely powerful in the domestic political discourse. In China, the children and sons-in-law of politicians are running important internet and technology companies. The nice thing about India is that neither of these two apply. The children and sons-in-law of Indian politicians are not running technology companies. And the American technology giants are not very effective in this political landscape. So I think that gives us a better place in terms of being able to grapple with these situations. And in that sense, the political economy here is closer to what we see in Europe and less like what we see either in America or in China. The second thing that I see is that we have an even greater problem of low state capacity. So if everywhere in the world governments are grappling to come to terms with this situation, then we in India are even worse. We have a very big problem in terms of state capacity. Here are a couple of examples. We talk about the problem of privacy. As of today, we've not even begun on the question of privacy. We've got a spectacular Supreme Court ruling 2 months ago, and we're still at the early stages of figuring out how that will translate into protections for private persons and protections against the state, protections against technology companies. So we're at the very early stages of figuring out privacy, and I'm thrilled and excited by that Supreme Court judgment, but I have to say it caught me by surprise. It could easily have been worse than that. So we are in a low state capacity environment where these things cannot be taken for granted. A second example of state capacity is in our competition law. We are in an early stage of building competition regulation. We have two important cases in this field, one about the NSE case on currency derivatives trading, and another on taxi cabs. And my personal view is on both of them, the competition authority got it wrong. They failed to understand the complexities of what they were up against. The third example is in sheer blatant outright violation of law. Okay, so all of us have horror stories about Uber, but when I watched the story unfold in India, I thought the violations were particularly blatant. I mean, there was a black and white gap between what was the de jure state of law, and there was a corporation who was just completely violating those laws. And it again brings you to questions of state capacity. Where was the enforcement? What was the judiciary doing? These kinds of questions. I think we suffer from these problems even more. The third point I would like to make is about free riding. Okay, so hypothetically, you may think that suppose a bunch of European regulators and judges come up with new doctrine that makes a significant difference to how Facebook and Twitter and Uber operate? Is it directly the implication that we here in India will automatically benefit from this? I wish to say absolutely not, because nothing prevents a corporation from running different versions of its code in different geographies. So just because a certain version of Twitter runs in France, it doesn't mean that Twitter here is any safer. We're going to have to do our own heavy lifting. So for a contrast, India is able to free ride on the United States FDA on drug approvals. India is able to free ride on the European processes of drug approvals. Once you know that drug X is safe when attacking disease Y, that's knowledge that ports across boundaries. That will absolutely not apply here, because nothing prevents a corporation from running a different version of the code. And Twitter can be as toxic as it used to be here, even if rules change elsewhere in the world. Finally, what is the way forward? There are no easy ways forward, but I have one opinion on what could be important. I think we need a lot more product liability here. I think there is an old doctrine of product liability that if you buy a washing machine and the washing machine does harm to the person living in the house where the washing machine is operating, then there should be liabilities upon the maker of the washing machine. I think this simple idea will take us very far. When the software delivered gadgets go into my bedroom and do harm to me, then we should be attaching product liability on the people who do that. I think this simple idea will take us very far. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one to take the floor on that is Mr. James Mancini, analyst in competition division in the OECD.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think it's a tough set of comments to follow. I think it's been very interesting so far. At the risk of sounding a little bit of repetitive, I should thank CUTS very much for the opportunity to be here. I know that the OECD is very proud of its partnership with CUTS, and I think that events like this and great discussions like this are a very good example of why. I should also note that my views are mine and mine alone and don't necessarily reflect the views of the OECD or its member countries. And thank you to Professor Ireland for the chance to take a look at the paper. I think that it was a really interesting compilation of the types of issues. It's very broad in scope, and I think in particular the appendix that you had is kind of an inventory of all of the aspects of digital markets that can be a little bit challenging. So that was great, and I think that the wicked problem framework is a novel way of looking at things. So as I read it, and actually over the course of this discussion, I've come up with 3 points that I'd like to elaborate a little bit on and explore a little bit, and maybe we'll find some differences of opinion as well. The first is on the nature of issues that we're facing in digital markets. The second is on the capacity of regulators to respond, and the third is really what are the steps that regulators should look at taking to revise their regulatory frameworks in light of all of these digital changes. So the first comment, and I think I would maybe differ slightly with Professor Shah on this, I think that it's important to keep an open mind whenever we're looking at digital change. I think that in some ways the zeitgeist has almost flipped 180 degrees to being completely deferential of technology companies to now talking about all of the ills. And I think that the overall tone of many of the discussions that we have nowadays, we use words like, disruption, which might have a negative connotation, chaos, and crowding, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit further in a minute. But I think that it's important to come back to the core principle, which comes from Clayton Christensen. He came up with this term that's often been abused, disruptive innovation. And the idea is that a disruptive innovation is something that comes in at the low end of the market, and it's something that seeks to cut out middlemen. So oftentimes it lowers prices for consumers, is the broader idea. It can overcome barriers to entry, including regulatory barriers to entry, and I think that's a lot of the source of the problems that we're dealing with today. And it can significantly improve accessibility of services in the ideal world. And so I think it's a particularly relevant type of technology issue to consider in LDCs. And I mean, that's not to say that there aren't some really significant policy challenges, and I know that a perfect example was a study that I was reviewing recently by the FTC on data brokers. So the idea is the data brokers can scrape information from your online presence from a variety of different places, whether it's social media accounts or even payment records. And what they can do is actually reconstruct a profile of you, and that can be used for a variety of risk management tools. So it can be used for credit applications, it could be used for job applications, background checks, things like that. So on the one hand, obviously this creates really significant privacy concerns, particularly because consumers are generally not very aware of the fact that their information is going to be used for this purpose. But on the flip side, it can actually have a lot of promise, and we've seen a few companies in South America that are coming up with using these methods with the awareness and consent of consumers to be able to construct alternative credit scores. So this is a way of actually improving access to financial systems for people that may not have bank accounts and have a hard time kind of building up a traditional credit rating. So there's a lot of positive promise, and I think that it's important for regulators to come at this issue not viewing it as a problem to be solved, but as something to think about. And so with that in mind, I thought of a couple of the descriptors that Professor Ireland used when we're talking about these digital innovations. And I think that it's important to remember that it depends on a case-by-case basis. So for example, if we're talking about markets becoming more and more crowded because of digital entrants, I think that from a competition perspective, and this is a big concern of ours, there's a lot of cases where the problem is the opposite, that markets aren't crowded enough. And so because of really significant network effects, high economies of scale, you have these concerns where you may have competition for the market. So this kind of tipping point where a single large dominant firm, and I won't name any names, but I'm sure we can all come up with a couple, a single large dominant firm can play an outsized role. And so in this case, it's not a question of crowding or not crowding, it's really a question of whether that market is contestable, and whether the dominance of that player is being used to distort competition and prevent entry by other market participants. And the other word that I thought was interesting was the word chaos. Because again, there's competition concerns that actually markets are not chaotic enough. That because of algorithms and the high degree of transparency of prices, it's allowing actually some firms, particularly in highly concentrated markets, to live a nice, quiet life where they can have this tacitly collusive outcome that doesn't require them to be chaotic. And I think that part of the initial promise of this disruptive innovation is to inject an element of chaos into the markets, which is a really positive thing from a competition point of view, even if it can create some significant challenges for regulators. And I think that at the end of the day, so I've talked a little bit about chaos, I've talked a little bit about crowding, and this has been touched on several times today. A lot of these issues are not really new. Maybe the degree of speed with which they're evolving is new. Maybe the combination of issues that we're dealing with at a single time is new, but on balance, they're not new. And so that brings me to my second point, which is, are regulators ready and are they fit for purpose? And I think that it's clear that we can talk all day about the various challenges that regulators face, but I actually have a pretty optimistic perspective on it. If you're a sector regulator, for example, I think that this is a great opportunity for you to actually look at modernizing and adapting your regulation. There may be things that you've known about for a long time that you would love to change, and this is a great opportunity to do it. And if you're a competition authority, I think it's important to not only be conscious about using your tools, but it's a great way to come back to first principles. So the thing that we keep on hearing over and over again at the OECD, and we had a great discussion on two-sided markets, for example, recently, the idea is that you shouldn't throw out all of your old analytical tools, that in fact there are a lot of really practical adaptations that you can make, and so you don't have to start from square one. And even if you can't use an established model or a quantitative method, there are definitely ways that you can at least use those methods as a underlying inspiration for thinking about a framework for thinking about a problem when you're analyzing it. So really important to just not throw everything out. Now, one thing that Professor Ireland did underline, okay, I should speed up. One thing that Professor Ireland did underline, which I think is a really great point, is the idea that we shouldn't simply be regulating for the sake of regulating, doing something just to respond. So there's a need to, in particular, be able to show in a persuasive way that there's harm in a market, and that we have a mechanism for doing something about it. And so this brings to my final point, because I really wanted to actually come out with a little bit of an action item or something that regulators could do, because I think a lot of these forum, there tends to be a lot of shrugging and hand waving and no one really knows what to do. And so as I said, I think that a lot of regulators can use this kind of disruption as an opportunity. There's a lot of tools out there to help you conduct an analysis of your regulation, and if you'll forgive the shameless plug, the OECD has a competition assessment toolkit, for example, which allows you to take an inventory of the regulations in your sector. You can consider the impact on competition. You can consider alternatives, consider whether these regulations are even needed. So for example, we've done a study of the legal services market. And in a lot of cases there, the underlying market failures that Professor Shaw was discussing are actually partially being addressed by technology, or they're being addressed in a different way by technology. So there's a need to kind of change the approach. And the underlying concept here is really, it's very important to understand why you have the regulation there in the first place, what it's supposed to address, whether those problems still exist, whether there are new problems, and then try and respond accordingly. And maybe the final point I would make is to emphasize the behavioral aspect. I know that that's a very vogue subject in economics, but there are again some really practical tools out there. I think the UK Competition and Markets Authority is a great leader in this area. They've engaged in quite a few studies in cooperation with sector regulators, and they have really practical insights, because traditionally a lot of the standard approach to dealing with some regulatory issues, especially if you're a competition authority, you want to allow competition to do your work. So you're really focused on improving consumer information. That's always been a big focus. But what we're finding is that even sometimes when consumers have the information, even if you have a document that gets distributed door to door saying you will earn X extra dollars by changing banks, people tend to exert a high degree of inertia. I'm just finishing up. People tend to exhibit a really high degree of inertia, and there's a lot of behavioral biases. So there's a lot of ways that regulators can come up with novel approaches that really reflect the behavioral economics insights that are starting to come out. Some of those include kind of leveraging social pressures, and so I will leave it to that. Just I guess my final message would be: don't lose hope too much.
Very good. Thank you. So it's time now to you to react, to ask some question. So we have more or less 20 minutes to do that. So. Be short, precise, remark or question. I give you. Yes, I give you the floor. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Sridhar. I haven't read your paper, right? But if you talk about the role for competition law, what do we do now? Like, should we give them just like a window period to gain critical mass? But I believe the question of critical mass comes when already there is a player, and this person, this new entrant who's trying to gain critical mass is trying to eat into the market share, right? To gain the network effects. But if we give the window period, no competition, like a regulatory holiday, it would be difficult to control it later on, because the consumers might get locked in because of the network effects. So what is it that you suggest? Or should we assign the role to regulatory authorities the way the Indian FDI in e-commerce did? Like, the platform owner in no way would influence the prices of the product on the platform. What's your take on it?
Okay, I take two other questions and then I come back to the yes, the second one. It was there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question to the panel, excluding perhaps to James, with whom I agree to a considerable degree, is to get the views on the following proposition. To the standard, theory that government regulation is premised on market failures, should we not have an intermediate question whether government regulation necessarily makes things better off relative to the status quo. And if the answer to that is negative, then perhaps, being in the constrained universe that we are, we best wait for technological evolution to sort of take us out to a better equilibrium than chase our tails, empowering the regulators, which again, given the political economy, is a very difficult quest. Thank you.
Okay, you don't say to who you ask your question, but
To the whole panel, to the panel excluding perhaps James.
okay. And the third question. Who wants the floor? At this stage, nobody.
Is important for the platform, and one of the ways is to discount, and one of the ways is to treat one side as subsidy side, and therefore the regulation are not regulation which enforces platform providers not to influence the price is not going to work, because they have to influence the price in order to gain the critical mass, because one side has to be subsidized in some way or the other. So one of the possible regulatory response could be that you allow, for example, discounted pricing or capital dumping to go on for some time, and if the regulator thinks that the exponential phase of growth started happening, then put a bar on it. I mean, I know that critical mass for each of these sectors could be very different, and it is not known even to the platform service provider. So it's a difficult question, but I think that providing a window for an incumbent to attain a critical mass may not be a bad idea.
Okay.
That window can be a sliding window.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to answer to the second question in the panel?
A need to first do no harm if you're trying to respond, but I think it's also important to take a step backward and to think to what degree does the regulation that is currently there already kind of define the market? So is it, does it specify a technology? Does it specify a specific business model? In that case, maybe there is a case for changing regulation to make sure that you've opened up in a way that's not going to undermine the original purposes of the regulation.
Thank you. Other question or remarks? Yes, there.
So, good evening. My name is Amol Kulkarni. When we are talking about regulatory responses to such disruptive sectors, while I noticed that one of the panelists have talked about using tools such as competition impact assessment, do you think that that could be partially successful and we should have a little bit broad-based approach? There are tools like regulatory impact assessment which advocate for ex-ante estimating possible impacts of regulation and adopting such regulatory alternative which has potential to result in maximum net benefit. There are also tools like regulatory sandbox which allow experimenting with these disruptive technologies for a limited period through which regulators can build their capacity and come out with a better regulation. I would request the panel to share their thoughts on experiences with these tools, and would these tools be useful for low capacity regulators in countries like India? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. If there is no other question.
To the whole panel, what about the issue of cross subsidies when you're looking at market and disruption, right? Obviously, these disruptors don't necessarily have to be the new shining startup. It could be well-heeled, well-funded, extremely powerful companies that have a dominant share in another market, but use that to obviously enter into another market. And then the question becomes, what do you look at in terms of the definition, in terms of standard competition parlance of saying, is this, in a sense, disruptive from a predatory pricing perspective, dominant share perspective? Those questions, how would they be answered in that context?
Okay, and the last one.
Yes, I am Shivashish Gupta from IIM Bangalore, and this question or comment is directed to Professor Ajay Shah. Professor Shah talked about essentially what may be called the public interest theory of regulation. That is, there are market failures of different types, and therefore the government responds by providing the appropriate regulation. Sometimes it's also called the normative as positive theory of regulation, in the sense something ought to be done, so therefore it is done. But there's another theory of regulation which is sometimes called the economic theory of regulation, which suggests that that regulation, like any other good, responds to the laws of demand and supply. Regulation is demanded by industries and it is supplied by the government, and so consequently the kind of regulation that you get is determined more by industry interests rather than responding to the needs of the public. I would suspect that have been laws around IP regulation, etc., intellectual property regulation seems to be more of a case of that. So there are different opinions as to, in certain industries one theory seems to operate, in certain others it seems the economic theory of regulation is more prevalent. So why, if at all, I don't know if you believe in this, but why do you think that this ICT markets and this particular sector would be more amenable to, say, the public interest theory of regulation?
Okay, so I will give very shortly the floor to the panelists, and then I will ask to Mr.
I think that we all today will understand that regulation is inevitably imperfect and controversial. So if when we think about optimal regulation is a regulation that is accepted to be that its cost is we minimize the cost of inefficiency and the cost of controversy. And the thinking of optimal regulation in the theoretical sense doesn't make a lot of sense actually. So when we are going about the design, one of the major issues is how to reduce the cost of controversy in terms of legal litigation or legal challenges, and also the potential inefficiencies. So that's, I think, address two of the questions here.
Yeah, I completely agree with the direction that you're going in. Public choice theory teaches us that politicians and officials are self-interested. It is important for us to put on a whiteboard and a starry-eyed and optimistic view of the world, and then it is important for us to be practical and realistic that state capacity constraints will interfere. I just lump all this under state capacity, that competence, incorruptibility, this is what is state capacity, and I worry that we in India will often come up short.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of big companies cross-subsidizing in another market, I think there's no problem with that because in many cases, if you have network effects, this cross-subsidizing is building a sort of like a demand for the particular product. But having said that, this point about behavioral psychology and economics, it's really important because by cross-subsidizing, it could change consumer behavior in a sense that that it in a not very good way. For example, in ride sharing, right? The over-dependence of consumer on particular modes of transport can change because of this cross-subsidizing. But then there's also a similar example of maybe infrastructure in the case of e-commerce, and in countries where there is a lack of infrastructure to support that e-commerce. Some of the companies have gone on to heavily invest in infrastructure and logistics to make sure that their business model kind of work. That would give you a sort of like a different issue than a developed country which have a developed logistics system. So I think it's important to look at country by country. Someone mentioned about developing and developed country differences.
Thank you. Mr. Ireland, do you want to comment? Huh? And I give you, it's possible, maximum 5 minutes, if you can.
I think I could be even shorter. First off, I thought the comments of all of you, including those that were not directed directly at my paper, were very, very helpful. I love the comment about disruptive technologies not being properly defined. From my experience with disruptive technologies, it's all in the eye of the beholder. For me, these technologies work great because they provide me with opportunities. But if I lost my job or my business, I would call it disruptive. And I think I saw the same thing in biotechnology. Farmers loved biotechnology. It's the ethical concerns, the religious concerns that cause problems. The second point, I'd like to go back to James, and I really appreciate the fact that you actually read the whole paper. That came as a very pleasant shock. And I just want to reiterate a very good point you made, is that this all looks very new, but going back to your basic criteria, I think is a good place to start. And we've been talking about this fully for that last 2 days, as a matter of fact. 2 basic criteria for regulatory intervention, competition or whatever. Is there evidence of regulatory harm, anti-competitive effects, consumer harm, consumer detriment? And does it look as though those effects are substantial and not likely to change in the future through normal market forces? And I think when I go to developing countries to talk about competition law and regulation, that's what I always insist on. If you don't see a problem, don't try to make it up. It's not theoretical. The theory helps you in your analysis, but it doesn't help you to come to a judgment. There's got to be real harm out there before you act, because otherwise you could be getting into a type 1 error and setting up a regulation that chills competition and chills innovation. So that's my final comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, yes, an applause for such a dynamic and vibrant discussion. But if I can, because it's in my position, I can, so I try. Of course, I think that whatever we will do, what about regulation of this new sector? Is it new or not? That was a question. And maybe it's more capitalism, the platform, as really a new sector, because of course that's the same question and the same problems, even if it's by violation of the rules that some big companies took place as Uber. I'm surprised that we spoke especially about Uber and Airbnb, but not so much about the small startups starting to work with platforms that are differently as the big one. That's another question. But if we have to regulate, I think that the word as liability, relevancy, a process, and maybe not rules decided one day, but of course a process of decision, a capacity to decide. It means that it requests also in the state and government spaces more competencies or more skills to do that, and maybe also to go back to the fundament of economy in order to avoid to lose you head or lose you ideas because we are in a new sector. No, maybe we need the same base adapted or reinterpreted, as you said. So I think that there's a lot of things to do, and I hope that in your capacities you will try to use all what was said today to go further in the state, in the civil society, in the economic sector, in the competition bodies that you have in charge. So I thank the panelists and I thank the two authors of the papers, because it was really useful with many description. Even if we not have the solution, we are a little bit further as we started. So thank you for that.